Once you've marked that song, I want to continue a thought that we began last week. I think next week we're probably going to take a little bit of a break on this mini-series because next week our scripture reading is Matthew chapter 3, and I want to focus a little bit on what is found in Matthew chapter 3 next week. There's a very exciting aspect of Matthew chapter 3 that I want to cover while that is our scripture reading. But I want to continue this week the thought of God said so first. And again, what I want to do with this little mini-series is to identify several aspects, and I'm not going to cover all aspects, but several aspects that I've found of interest in my life where the Bible makes a statement, and it has taken man thousands of years to catch up to what the Bible taught. And basically the idea of this is that the Bible verifies that it's true. Because God, as creator of the world, is the only individual that would know some of the things that science has taken thousands of years to unearth. There's no way that people of the time would have had any way of knowing these things. So what I want us to discuss right now this morning is the idea of water covering the earth. This is a study of geology. And I believe a couple of houses down, we have a woman who is a professor at Marietta College, a geology teacher, I believe. And so I thought about her. She has geologist on her license plate. That's, what perked my interest to begin with. The earth and water. In the book of Genesis, the Bible talks about the earth being covered in water. Not once, but twice. The earth was covered by water. And so I want to go back first to the book of Genesis chapter 1. And if we look in Genesis chapter 1, verses 2 through 9, we see at the very beginning, during the early stages of the creation week, we see that the earth was covered with water here. In the creation account, as it is recorded for us, the Bible says in Genesis chapter 1 and in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." So before the earth really took on the form that we can see from outer space today, it was in a different mass, if you will. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water." So think about this from a geologist's perspective. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the water. So what he's doing is he's separating the moisture in the air from the water that's on the ground. And so God is separating those waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. Today we would call that atmosphere. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered." So up to this point, the earth was basically a swamp. "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now, we're just going to stop right there in our creation account. So that is the first time when God talks about that the earth was covered with water. The second time that the earth was covered with water is found in Genesis chapter 7. Now, we might think of this, since it's only 7 chapters away, we might think of this as being relatively close as far as time goes. But the truth is, a long expanse of time has elapsed. Mankind has become evil and wicked in the sight of God. And God has decided to destroy the earth. And in Genesis chapter 7, we read about what we might refer to as Noah's flood or the Great Flood. And I want to begin in verse 19. And Genesis 7:19 says, and so God sent this flood to destroy the wickedness from the face of the earth. Now, all that was saved was Noah and his family. So oftentimes we call this Noah's flood. But I want to ask you something. Wow, this is a rabbit trail. Ruth will love it. What did Noah do while he was building the ark? He preached. That's right. He preached. And do you know how many years he preached for?
100.
That's right, Peter. He preached for 100 years. 100 years. Took him 100 years to build the ark. He preached for 100 years. You know how many people he managed to save with that preaching? Yep. 3 sons, 3 daughters-in-laws, and his wife. It makes me feel better. You know, sometimes as a preacher, you get thinking that nobody's listening. Nobody's out there. Nobody cares. I can't imagine being Noah and having nobody listen to you after preaching for 100 years. I would be so sick of preaching. So this is I brought that up as a rabbit trail. Point of interest. But here's what the Bible says about the water covering the earth. Genesis 7, verse 19. Genesis 7:19 says, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains and covered them 15 cubits. Well, cubits about 18 inches, so you can kind of think about that. 15 cubits is going to be 20, 30, somewhere between 20 and 30 feet. 24 feet, I suppose, would probably be fairly close. You think about that. The highest mountain being under 20 to 30 feet of water. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. And birds, livestock, all swarming creatures that swarmed on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Okay, so 2 times the earth was covered with water. This is important because as you study geology, what the study of geology is, my understanding is boiling down to the simplest form, is a study of rock formations. So you study rocks. Rock formations are important. But one of the coolest things, in my opinion, one of the coolest things about rock formations is fossils. Now, I have been fascinated since a child with fossils. And I collected fossils as a child. My family, I have relatives in Utah. And we traveled to Utah to see my aunt and uncle and my cousins one time when I was fairly small yet. But every state we went to, I tried to find fossils in that state. And in Utah, we were in Utah in the East Desert. My uncle said, let's go out to the East Desert. We wanted to go hunting for 2 things, arrowheads and fossils. So we went to the East Desert. And I brought back a 5-gallon bucket of dinosaur bones. And when I was in high school, we went on a field trip with Dr. Stone, of all things, from Marietta College. And Dr. Stone was a geologist. And he took our our high school class on a trip, and we looked for fossils. And we found all kinds of fossils, not very far from here. If you go up the interstate between exit 16 and exit 25, there's a fossil dig that Marietta College uses, right along the interstate, at a little place called Dudley, Ohio. And I brought one of my dinosaur bones with me to show Dr. Stone. And he looks at it and he goes, "Oh my, do you know what this is? Do you know what you have?" "Oh, it's a dinosaur bone. Beyond that, I didn't know anything." And it was a kind of a curved piece of bone, probably about, if I remember right, about 3 inches long. Mom still has it, but it kind of looked like almost like a banana in shape, a small banana. Dr. Stone looked at it, he says, that is a thumbnail off of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. I thought, whoa, that's amazing. So it's always interested me, the study of geology. But the thing is, geology also studies the sedimentary layers. And so that's why it's important for us to look at this water, because we're going to get into that in a little bit. If what we believe is correct, and Moses is the author of the book of Genesis, then this would place the dating of the writing of the book of Genesis at about 1,491 years before Christ. Maybe as late as 1,451 years before Christ, Moses penned this book as we know it today. So I believe Moses is the author, and I believe this is a fairly accurate time period. He wrote it while he was in the desert, after the children of Israel had left Egypt. On Wednesday night, we've been studying the book of Exodus, and we're going to get into some of Moses' writings. But he wrote down the history. The name Genesis means beginnings. And so all things began in the book of Genesis. David wrote in the book of Psalms, and somewhere around 103 years it should be 1,003 years before Christ to 975 years before Christ. David wrote in the book of Psalms about creation, and the Psalms are songs, and he's singing about the magnitude of God. We're going to go back to the book of Psalms and read what David wrote about creation. And so we'll see David's understanding of creation in Psalm 104. Psalm 104, and I want to begin in verse 6. Psalm 104 and verse 6, David writes, "You covered it with the deep, as with a garment." He's talking about covering the earth. God covered the earth with the deep, with the water, as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. So he's referring back to Genesis. When God separated the earth, the dry land, from the water, he says the water fled. At the sound of your thunder, they too took flight. The mountains rose, and the valleys sank down to the place you appointed for them. So I mentioned last week, there's a song I used to sing, and I wish I had it in the books, and one of these days I'll make a copy of it. But I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise. I sing the mighty power of God that spread the seas abroad. Something along those lines. We used to sing it somewhere I preached at. I don't remember where or what songbook it's in, but I'm going to find that song again. And it's based on this text of what David says, the mountains rose and the valleys sank. He says in verse 9, you set the boundaries that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. In other words, God set boundaries for the oceans. God set boundaries for seas. God set the boundaries for the waters. And once Noah's flood was over, those waters have stayed basically within their boundaries. We have some fluctuations, but basically they're in their boundaries. Scientists will tell us that with the melting of the polar ice caps and such, that the water level does rise. And I would say that's fairly accurate. But what does all water do? It flows downhill. God set that in motion. When he created the earth, he created the water to be heavier and to flow downhill. And so that is a basic concept that God created. Moses wrote of a time when the earth was formless in the book of Genesis. We read that in chapter 1. And that word formless that is translated there in the Hebrew language means without purpose. Water covered everything, kind of like I mentioned the swamp. It was at this point in creation that God separated the waters and made a form. That's what David's talking about here in Psalm 104. God making the form of the earth to stand up out of the waters. The water, David says, was gathered. David uses that term, gathered into seas. We might say seas and oceans today on the face of the earth. So that water God made so that it would gather in a certain location. And the moisture was gathered into the air. We call that atmosphere. We see clouds in the sky. And those clouds are nothing more than evaporated moisture in very small forms that are light enough to be carried across the United States, across our skies, and they contain moisture. If you get down into West Virginia, and I love to travel through the mountains of West Virginia, but if you get down into the big mountains, what do they have? They have warning signs, cloud cover. And so sometimes you go down through there and it's like driving through fog. You know what fog is, Quinn? Fog is nothing but water in the air, and it inhibits your view. God separated the water. So you have water on the ground, mud puddles, rivers, oceans, seas, and then you've got water in the sky. God did all that. Fun facts, though. The Bible clearly states that not once but twice, as we just read, not once but twice, waters covered the earth. The second time is possibly, in my estimation, the most important. Both of these times it covered the tallest of the mountains. When the earth was without form, in the book of Genesis on the day of creation, it covered the mountains. When it was destroyed with the flood, it covered the mountains, leaving evidence. We're going to talk about that evidence. The great flood, or Noah's flood, as some of you might know it. Something that we teach our children about, the ark, the animals. It's a fun story. But Noah's flood accounts for sea life. You know what fossils we were digging for in Dudley, Ohio? Just south of Caldwell? Sea fossils. Now, how in the cat hair did sea fossils get in this part of Ohio? My understanding is the rock formation that makes up that fossil formation that runs through Dudley also comes up somewhere over behind Newport. I don't know exactly where. I remember Dr. Stone talking about the formation and where it resurfaced above ground. But what I found amazing, I can't remember and I should have had this for the lesson, I can't remember how many feet we are above sea level here. But the idea that there are sea fossils in this region of Ohio tells me that at one time this region was underwater. The only logical explanation that can be found for sea fossils being found in all, not some, not one or two, but all of the Earth's major mountain ranges is that the Bible is accurate. And the Bible is true, and there really was a flood that covered the earth. You know where we found dinosaur bones in Utah? That East Desert is a mountainous range. You found those dinosaur bones on high ground. It's incredible, the evidence that God has left us that His Word is true. Geology. Why is it important? Well, geology is a branch of earth science concerned with both solid, which is the fossils, rocks, solid, and liquid. You can't have one, you can't study one without studying the other. The rocks of which the earth is composed, the process by which they change over time is liquid. So geologists study both the solid form and the liquid form of the earth. In speaking of the origins of the study we know of as geology, Walter H. Butcher wrote, "Before geology could assume the character of a separate scientific discipline, the basic science, the knowledge of animals and plants, and the geology of continents and oceans had to advance sufficiently." In other words, what he's saying is science had to progress to a certain point before we could study geology. We'll get to that in a minute. He says to provide a focus for thought concerning minerals, rocks, fossils, and landscapes. But above all, intelligent observation of what is seen in nature had to be substituted for the scholastic habit of reasoning in terms of abstract concepts. And I think that bottom part is where most geologists might get confused. We have to sometimes set aside what is obvious in nature in order to become confused by human science. Geologists, the study of geology has its origins in 1669. And in 1669, a scientist from Danish descent was living in Italy. The scientist's name is Nicholas Steno. He was drawn to the structure of a section of Italy called Tuscany. It's in central Italy. And this region has kind of a unique earth structure to it. And he lived in this region. He was drawn to it. His study led him to observe mountains and rock formations where he found fossils. Nicholas Steno published his findings in a small book marking the beginnings of the study of geology in 1669. So geology is a relatively new science and a relatively new study compared to other scientific studies. But they've made up for lost time. One of the first geologists, Edward Seuss, published a study based on the geologic framework of all countries. His research led him to discover what? All land surfaces had been underwater. This guy's discovering this in 1885. Moses wrote it. How many thousand years? He wrote it thousands of years before Christ. Okay, so geologists caught up to the Bible. But how long did it take? We could have told him that all the earth was underwater, but no, they had to discover it for themselves. And so sometimes, but what does that do? What did Edward Seuss prove? The Bible was right all along. It proved that Genesis is accurate. On a spatial note, now in modern geologists now accept that even the oldest rock formations that can be found, such as the Grand Canyon, okay, that's one of the oldest rock formations where you can see the layers of rocks. Geologists love it. I've never been there. I want to go to the Grand Canyon. Someday before I die, I want to see the Grand Canyon, see that rock formation. But what they accept in places like the Grand Canyon is that all rock formations show a sedimentary origin, meaning that when the earth was, quote, without form in the book of Genesis, and what David talks about, the mountains rising in the book of Psalms, is evidence of when God separated the water from the earth, that sediment that came out of the water and settled into a formation. That is evidence of what David talked about in the book of Psalms. And it gets me so excited when I see the evidence that God is real and that His Word is real. Sedimentary origins simply mean the whole earth was underwater. Who said it first? Who said it first, Dennis? God did. God said it first. The Bible clearly stated that it has what has taken man thousands of years to discover. Clearly stated, Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Clearly state the earth was underwater. Despite all the evidence, though, I find it incredibly sad. Dr. Stone was an avowed atheist. I find it so sad. A man who dedicated his life to the study of what amounts to nothing more than the evidence of creation, the evidence of the flood. I don't understand the concept. To me, when I look at this, and if you look at creation scientists, what it amounts to is a creation scientist and an evolution scientist, we come from two different points of view. And we study the same thing from two different points of view. In other words, we allow our preconceived notions to cloud our vision of what is clear. Even as a Christian, as a creationist, I need to not let my preconceived notions cloud my view of what is evident. And I would ask the same of anyone who's studying science who does not believe in God. Don't allow your preconceived notions to cloud your view. Because I believe that if we're looking at the same facts and the same evidences, that we can come to the same conclusion. Hopefully we can do that together as a society and as a world someday in the future. In closing, I want to go back to the book of Psalms. Last week we ended in the book of Romans. This week I want to end in Psalm 119. And Psalm 119 is the longest psalm in the Bible. But in verse 81, the psalmist says, "My soul longs for your salvation, my hope in your word. My eyes long for your promise. I ask, when will you comfort me? For I have become like a wineskin in smoke." The psalmist says, I've become dry and brittle. A wineskin in smoke is going to be so brittle that if it's bent, it will crack. That's what the psalmist says. He's become so tired sometimes we as Christians can become tired. Tired of defending. Tired of standing up for what the Bible teaches. But the psalmist says, "Yet I have not forgotten your statutes. How long must your servant endure? When will you judge those who persecute me? When will God judge those who deny the evidence that surrounds us of God? The insolent have dug pitfalls for me. They do not live according to your law. All your commandments are sure. They persecute me with falsehood. Help me." The psalmist cries to God, "Help me." "They have almost made an end of me on the earth, but I have not forsaken your precepts. In your steadfast love give me life, that I may keep the testimonies of your mouth." The Christian should pray along the lines of that psalm, that God would give us the ability to endure, that God would help us to keep His commandments and not to lose faith. Today, evolution has taught us fact, and yet for all of its glory, it is still called a theory. And it will remain a theory until it is proven beyond the shadow of a doubt to be false. I hope that I live to see that day, but even if I don't live to see that day, it will happen. Evolution will be proven to be a false theory because it cannot be proven accurate. If you're here today, I want to encourage you. Know God. Know God. Because He's the creator of the universe. He's the creator of us. He made us. The psalmist says He formed us when we were inside of our mothers. He made us into the people that He wants us to be. But He wants us to know Him, to be obedient to His will, to accept His plan of salvation because He wants to save us. He wants to save us, and He wants us to be His child. The reason I want to study Matthew chapter 3 next week with you, I'll give you a little spoiler. Turn there with me for just a moment. Matthew chapter 3, very briefly. You know, the thing is, Jesus was always the Son of God. He was always God's child. Right from the day He was born, actually the day He was conceived. When the angel told Mary that she would have a child, Jesus was the child of God. But you know the very first time that God acknowledged Jesus as His Son, as His child, is found in Matthew chapter 3. When Jesus comes up out of the water from being baptized. It says here in Matthew chapter 3, and I want to begin in, let's see, let's begin in verse 13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to Jordan, to John to be baptized by him. And John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized of you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented, and when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up out of the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw, John saw, the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest upon him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." It's at this point that God acknowledges that Jesus is His child. It's in baptism that God acknowledges that we are His children. When we accept His terms and become His child. I want to encourage anyone who's here this morning, a child of God, make the decision. Become a child of God. It's a decision you'll never regret. It's a decision that will change your life forever for the better. You turn your songbooks 541 as